It is early spring, and the grain barrel is nearly empty. A medieval family is staring at the bottom of the one thing that stands between them and starvation. The harvest was fine, nobody was lazy, and nobody wasted a handful. The killer was the calendar, the gap between the day the old food runs low and the day the new crop comes in, and in a bad year that gap killed more people than any war or plague. These are the 7 crops a medieval family quietly bet their lives on, in the order they came to the rescue, and keep one eye on the last 2 because they decided whether a family came through the winter merely alive or actually healthy. Crop number 1 is rye, the grain that refused to die. Rye is the reason this family is even alive in spring to do their worrying, and it earned that job by growing where nothing else would. You can sow rye into thin, sour, sandy ground that would kill a wheat plant outright. You can put it in during autumn as the first hard frosts arrive, and it will sit through the winter under the snow and come up strong while the world is still brown. Compare that to wheat, the grain everyone actually wanted. Wheat made the pale, soft, beautiful bread that lords ate off clean linen, the bread every peasant dreamed about and almost never got. But wheat is fussy. It wants good soil, mild weather, and a fair share of luck, and when it does not get all 3, it fails, sometimes down to nothing. Rye rewards you with a dark, dense, faintly bitter loaf that sits heavy in the stomach and keeps for the better part of a week. And it almost never gives you nothing, which mattered more than anything, because in the medieval world, nothing was the thing you feared. Plenty of families refused to even choose between the 2 grains. They sowed wheat and rye together in the very same field, a deliberate mixture called maslin, so that whatever the weather did to one, the other would probably carry the field. Maslin was an insurance policy, written in seed and buried in a field, months before anyone could know what the winter would bring. Rye carried one hidden danger, though. In a wet year, a fungus called ergot could grow on the ears, and bread baked from infected grain brought on burning limbs, convulsions, and hallucinations. Whole villages were struck at once, and the medievals named the sickness St. Anthony's fire, never suspecting that their own survival bread was the cause. The one grain that refused to die could feed you and poison you in the same loaf. But survival bread on its own is a grim, dark diet, and bread on its own was never how a medieval family really ate. What turned bread into an actual meal? Crop number 2 is barley, the single seed that filled both the bowl and the cup. If rye was the grain of survival, barley was the everyday workhorse, and across huge stretches of medieval Europe, it was simply the most common thing growing anywhere you looked. Barley makes a heavy, gritty bread on its own, and most of it never became a loaf at all. It went into the pot. It thickened the daily pottage, the thick simmering stew of grain and vegetables that hung over almost every peasant fire from one year to the next. Then barley did its second job, the one people always forget when they picture the Middle Ages. Barley was brewed. Ale was food and safe drink at the same time, brewed weak and cloudy and thick with calories, and it was drunk daily by absolutely everyone, including small children, in amounts that would alarm a modern doctor. Water could make you sick. Ale, boiled in the making, usually did not. Barley ran so deep in daily life that it even worked as money. Rents were paid in it, wages were part paid in it, and much of the ale brewed from it came from the alewives, women who brewed at home and sold to their neighbours, in one of the few trades a medieval woman could run in her own name. A field of barley was 2 harvests from a single seed, bread in the bowl and drink in the cup. Lose your barley and you went hungry and dry at the same time. But barley and wheat still wanted decent ground and a kind season, and an enormous number of medieval families had neither. What fed the family clinging to a cold, wet hillside where the rain never stopped? Crop number 3 is oats, the grain that held up the entire farm. In the wet uplands of the north, across much of Scotland and Wales, and the rain-soaked western edges of England, oats were king for one blunt reason. Nothing better would grow there. Oats shrug off cold and damp that make wheat rot in the ear and leave barley sulking in the mud. They went into pottage, into thick porridge, into flat oatcakes cooked on a hot stone by the fire, and in parts of the medieval north, oats were the daily bread itself, eaten at nearly every meal from cradle to grave. To the wheat country in the south, those oat-eating hills seemed like another world entirely. Centuries later, an English dictionary would still sneer at oats as a grain that fed horses in England and people in Scotland. The Scottish answer became famous in its own right. England raised fine horses, and Scotland raised fine men. Then Oats did one more thing, and this is where the year quietly starts to link into a single chain. Oats fed the animals. The ox that dragged the plough through heavy clay, the horse, the cow in the byre, all of them lived through winter on oats and straw. And animals that survived the winter did two things in spring that no peasant could live without. They pulled next season's plough, turning the soil no human could turn alone. And all through the cold months standing in the byre, they made manure, which went straight back out onto the fields to feed next year's grain. Lose your oats and you have lost far more than a bowl of porridge. You have lost the muscle that ploughs the land and the muck that feeds it. A dead ox in March meant fields that never got ploughed at all, and land that missed a planting fed nobody the following winter. And that manure points straight at a problem the grain itself was creating, the one almost every modern gardener misses. What happens to a field that grows grain year after year after year? Crop number 4 is the field pea, the protein that fed the family while it quietly fed the soil. Grain feeds you, but grain also strips the land. Plant grain in the same field season after season, and the ground goes tired and pale and thin, and the harvests shrink until one day they barely repay the seed. Medieval farmers could not have explained the chemistry to you, but they had watched it happen over the fence for hundreds of years, and they built their answer into the rotation. After grain came peas, and these were nothing like the sweet green peas you shell and eat fresh today. Field peas were grown on until the pods were dry and hard, then threshed and stored by the sackful and dropped into the pot right through the winter. Dried peas were the true backbone of pottage. There is a rhyme English children still sing about peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old, and it was barely an exaggeration. The pot stayed over the fire day after day, topped up with whatever the garden and the store could spare, and dried peas were the reason it counted as food at all. They turned a thin, watery broth into a meal that actually filled a working body and stayed with it through an afternoon of labour, and they were protein a family could store for a year or more without a cellar full of salt meat they could never afford. And where peas had grown, farmers noticed with their own eyes the next grain crop came up greener and stronger, as though the ground had been rested and quietly fed. They called it refreshing the land. Today we would call it nitrogen, and we would draw the diagram of how legumes pull it out of the air and lock it into the soil. The medieval farmer had no word for it and no diagram. He just had the result, repeated over generations. The peas were doing two jobs at once, feeding the family out of the storehouse and feeding the soil that fed the grain. Crop number 5 is the bean, the last wall between a family and the end. Broad beans and field beans were sown thick, grown hard, and dried like little stones. Beans stored even better than peas, and they would grow in cold, heavy ground where peas gave up. They went into the ground in late winter, tough enough to sit in cold mud that would rot anything softer. The first planting of the new year sown while the family was still eating the last stores of the old one. And in a truly desperate year, beans became the hardest, plainest insurance of the entire set. There was a bread made from ground beans and peas and coarse bran, and it had a name that tells you everything about how it was seen. It was called horse bread. Horse bread was so common that English towns wrote it into law, licensing which bakers could make it and setting rules for what went into the loaf. Even the bread of last resort had standards worth enforcing. In an ordinary year, it fed the horses and the working animals. In a bad year, it fed the people, and a family sitting down to horse bread knew exactly how close to the cliff edge they had come. But it was there. When the wheat had failed, and the rye had come up thin, and the barrel was scraping bottom, the beans drying in the barn were the reason the story did not simply end that spring. And every one of these 5 crops is still here. Rye, barley, oats, field peas, and beans are all still grown, still milled, and you can bake with them today. That is the idea behind the Medieval Way store. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The sourdough manual is for keeping a living leaven the way these families did. And the sourcing guide shows you where to find the real heritage grain. Now step back from the list for a moment, because it is far too easy to hear 5 crops counted off and think you are looking at 5 separate decisions. You are looking at one machine that has been hiding in plain sight this whole time, and it is worth watching it turn. The beans and the peas feed the soil. The fed soil grows the grain. The grain feeds the family and the animals. The animals pull the plough and make the manure. The manure feeds the soil that grows the beans. It is a closed circle, and every single crop in that circle is covering the weakness of another one. Wheat fails and rye stands behind it. Good ground fails and oats climb the hill. Grain exhausts the soil and the pulses refresh it. There is no one place where the whole system snaps. You could lose an entire crop, a crop you had sweated over from autumn to harvest, and still not starve because the others were left standing. Now set that against the way the world grows its food today. Roughly half of all the calories eaten on this planet come from just 3 grasses, wheat, rice, and corn. We took the medieval circle and we straightened it into a line, and a straight line has exactly one place where it can break. But grain and pulses only carry a family so far. Stored bread and dried peas will keep you alive across the winter. They will not keep you well. And that gap, the gap between merely alive and actually well, is exactly what the last 2 crops were for. Crop number 6 is the coalwart, the living larder that stayed green through the frost. It grew in the small kitchen garden right beside the house, the plot the family dug and weeded and guarded by hand. Coalwarts were the loose, tough, leafy greens the medievals bundled together under the old word warts, closer to today's kale than to any tight modern cabbage. And they mattered above all because of their timing. These greens stood out in the garden through autumn and pushed on deep into the frost, long after everything else had been cut and dried and locked away in the barn. Better still, you never had to harvest the whole plant at once. You could strip a few leaves at a time and leave it standing to grow more. Through the darkest, leanest, coldest months of the year, when the entire diet had collapsed into grey bread and grey pottage, the wurts were the one fresh, green, living thing left on the table. A hard frost even improved them, softening the leaves and sweetening the flavour, which medieval families knew long before anyone could explain the sugars behind it. And a handful of those leaves went into the pottage nearly every day, which means the peas, the barley, and the warts met in the same pot at almost every meal of the year. Nobody could have named a vitamin or drawn you a molecule, but they knew, as plainly as they knew anything, that a winter without their greens left the whole household weak and sick and slow to heal from the smallest cut, and a winter with them did not. A single row, tended and cut carefully, could feed a family in small green handfuls across an entire season, and a vegetable that kept growing where it stood, refusing to rot, was close to a miracle in a world with no other way to store anything soft. Crop number 7 is the leek, the smallest of the lot, and in some ways the cleverest of all. Leeks, together with their close cousins, the onion and garlic, were so central to the medieval kitchen garden that the garden itself took its name from the plant. The old word sitting inside leek is the same word that sat inside the name people once used for the whole vegetable plot, the enclosure of herbs and greens beside the house. When your word for kitchen garden is built around a single vegetable, that vegetable is telling you how much it mattered. The leek even climbed as far as national symbolism. In Wales, it became the emblem pinned to coats every St. David's Day, and the story goes that Welsh soldiers once wore leeks into battle to tell friend from enemy. A legend, probably, but nobody builds a legend around a vegetable that does not matter. And the Alliams did 3 separate things a struggling family could not get from anywhere else on the holding. First, they kept. Hung up and braided and stored in the cold, onions and their kin lasted for months, when almost nothing else fresh would last a fortnight. Second, they made the food edible. They took the endless, grey, repetitive pottage and gave it a bite and a warmth and a flavour that a person could actually look forward to, and that matters far more than it sounds when you are eating out of the same pot for the 5th straight month. And third, they were medicine. Leeks and onions and garlic ran all through medieval remedies, pressed onto wounds, boiled for coughs and chest illness, trusted for 100 small ailments. The 7th crop was seasoning and storage and the family medicine chest, all growing quietly in a single row at the edge of the garden. There are the 7. Rye that refused to die in ground nothing else would touch. Barley that filled both the bowl and the cup. Oats that kept the animals and farmed the hills. Peas and beans that fed the family and fed the soil underneath them. Worts that carried them living and green through the frost. And leeks that made the whole grim diet bearable and kept them on their feet. Not one of them was ever chosen for being the best. Every single one was chosen for being the thing still standing when the crop beside it fell. And even this was no proof against everything. When the cold rains came 3 years running, as they did across northern Europe in the Great Famine that began in 1315, even a system this carefully hedged could be overwhelmed, and hundreds of thousands of people died anyway. The medieval garden was never magic and never pretended to be. But on a normal bad year, the ordinary kind of bad year that came around again and again, it held. It held for one reason. It was built to survive failure, not to win a good season. We plant a great deal of one thing for the best possible yield in the best possible year. The medieval family spread their bet across 7 things so that no single disaster could take everything. One approach produces more when the weather is kind. The other is far harder to kill. Which of the 7 surprised you most? Comment below, subscribe for more forgotten history, and I will see you next time.